Victim number 2 was attacked and sexually assaulted.
Commonalities become kind of overwhelming.
Victim number 4 was taken at knife point, sexually assaulted multiple times. However, because of a lack of evidence at that time, he faced no consequences.
This is True Crime Arizona, an Arizona's Family Originals podcast.
There are cases that stick with sheriff's deputies most. Often, they're the ones where officials so desperately want to get justice for the most innocent victims, but are left instead with dead ends and no answers. For 36 years, hearts ached for Cathy Sposito, a 23-year-old college student who was hiking on the popular Thumb Butte Trail in Prescott, Arizona in June of 1987 when she was murdered, slain in the most heinous of ways. So when we got an email from the Yavapai County Sheriff's Office in August of 2023 that they were going to hold a press conference about the Cathy Sposito case, I was excited. I figured this was finally a big break in the case. And it was. But it was more than that. What you're about to hear is the unraveling of a decades-long serial predator with an ending that brings equal parts frustration and closure. Yavapai County Sheriff David Rhodes started with this.
I am saying today with high confidence, Cathy Sposito was murdered by Bryan Scott Bennett. Born in Calhoun, Kentucky, July the 30th, 1970. At the time of the murder of Cathy Sposito, Bryan Bennett was a high school student at Prescott High School, 1 month or so from, about 2 months actually, from his 17th birthday.
The sheriff's department showed his picture. He looked like a young boy because the reality was he was still a kid when Cathy was killed. It was chilling to look at. You'd never know by looking at him the evil that lived inside. So how did investigators tie Bryan Bennett to Cathy Sposito? It turns out they worked backwards from a different case after building a DNA profile from a victim who was sexually assaulted and attacked in the same area as Cathy just 3 years later. That would become victim number 2. The sheriff unravels the story.
We'll refer to Cathy as victim number 1. Victim number 2, who we are not publicly identifying, was attacked and sexually assaulted at nearly the same location and the same time of day on the same trail on Thumb Butte. 2 months later, Mr. Bennett was again accused of an attempted assault in Chino Valley. Victim number 3, who was at a kind of a young person's drinking party at the house, became queasy, went into a room, laid down. He followed her in there, locked the door, attempted to sexually assault her. She made statements to the investigators at the time that she believed he was going to kill her. People broke in the door. He ran past them. Mr. Bennett, that was the first time that he was actually publicly identified. And he was reported to the Chino Valley Police Department. He was actually arrested, and a trial commenced, and he was acquitted, unfortunately, based on some discrepancies in the eyewitness testimony. Again, on June the 2nd, 1993, victim number 4, who is identified as Renee Sandoval and is present with us today, was approached at the post office in Prescott. She was taken at knife point, sexually assaulted multiple times before the assault was broken up by a police officer who pulled them over, a Prescott police officer who pulled over the car that they were traveling in together. And there was an arrest. However, because of a lack of evidence at that time and discrepancies in the stories again, he faced no consequences.
This was terrifying. It also was unusual. Normally, you see an escalation in violence, yet of the 4 known victims, only Cathy, the first one, was murdered. The sheriff said the other 3 attacks were more or less interrupted, either by police or other people. But the surviving victims also recalled Bennett told them he would kill them if they made a sound, so they didn't. During Cathy's murder, witnesses recalled hearing screaming.
Sheriff's deputies say Cathy Sposito fought hard to save her life here on this hiking path. In fact, they said she left a trail of blood more than 125 feet long as she tried to escape her attacker.
Cathy died after being bludgeoned in the head and being shot in the eye with a .22 caliber. This press conference wasn't to announce an arrest, though, and I'm sure you're wondering why.
On January 27, 1994, Bryan Bennett ultimately completed suicide after going back to Kentucky. This case has so many incredible twists and turns. In about 2017, because DNA technology became more readily available, different things that they were able to do, there was a break in the case of victim number 2. And we were able to identify a descendant of Mr. Bennett and work backwards to victim number 2 and then eventually back to victim number 1.
So how did they tie all of this together? In November of 2022, Bryan Bennett's body was exhumed to collect a DNA sample from. They also had what they believed was a murder weapon used on Cathy, a socket wrench. They showed us a picture of it. This forensic work is certainly not without the heart of the people behind it. Take a listen to one of their cold case volunteers.
Well, good afternoon. My name is Rich Finston. I'm a cold case volunteer with the Sheriff's Department. And interestingly enough, the very first case I was assigned when I entered the cold case unit was Cathy Sposito, and that was 12 years ago. Excuse me for a minute. I've become kind of personally attached, as you might be able to see, but I'm going to try to get myself under control here and continue. In terms of the evidence, there were actually 46 pieces of individual evidence in the murder of Cathy Sposito that were submitted for DNA analysis over the period of many years to multiple different laboratories. When I was asked by Lieutenant Pritchard a few years ago, do you remember having reviewed the DNA from victim number 2 against Cathy Sposito? And I said, I don't think I ever did that, but let me go look. And within a matter of days, I was astounded by the consistency and comparison of the numbers that came through, and it looked like the same individual had his DNA presence on evidence in both cases, 3 years apart. You couple that with the time of day, the location, the modus operandi, the day of the week, and the commonalities become kind of overwhelming. The pivotal one, which was a ratchet wrench, which was used to bludgeon Cathy Sposito, found at the scene, and it contained her blood and hair. Obviously, it was used to bludgeon her. You would expect also that the suspect or perpetrator's DNA would be on that murder weapon. And so that was the premise going in. This particular evidence sample had a tremendous amount of DNA on it, looking at all the DNA collected over time. And everyone who is a person of interest was plotted out on a chart. Obviously, number 1 contributor was the victim, Cathy Sposito. Number 2 contributor was Bryan Bennett. And by far, the preponderance of the DNA was the victim and Bryan Bennett's.
That's when investigators get a better idea of what exactly happened in each assault.
3 years later, involving victim number 2, who was camping with her boyfriend at the Thumb Butte campground, went for a hike on this trail, and within minutes of leaving, she is attacked. There is a rock held to her head, and we know that Cathy Sposito was also hit in the head with a rock. Cathy Sposito was hit in the head with a rock. She was hit with that ratchet you saw the picture of. She was shot in the eye with a .22 caliber, and she was stabbed in the side of the head. And victim number 2 has this suspect, Bryan Bennett, come running up behind her, knock her down, and hold a rock to her head and tell her to be quiet or he will smash her head. And those were her statements. And then he completed his sexual assault on her, and then he ran off into the woods. And it should be noted that the Cathy Sposito, we have not tied weapons together. That kind of evidence doesn't exist. But Cathy Sposito was shot in the eye with a .22 caliber gun. The suspect, Bryan Bennett, he killed himself with a .22 caliber. The third case, which I described earlier, victim number 3, who we're not identifying here today, and I described what happened. Her violent attack inside of a house is broken up by people that are there, that are present. It goes to trial. There's not a conviction, unfortunately, which allows for Mr. Bennett to continue to roam the streets. Now, the fourth case.
The fourth case became a second main focus of the press conference, beginning with the haunting details of what Bennett did to a woman outside of a Prescott post office.
She's at the Miller Valley post office when she's approached, taken at knife point or something sharp, put in her own car, sexually assaulted, driven out into the woods, sexually assaulted more, believes that she is going to be murdered, and because of the work of an alert police officer, pulled over that vehicle for failure to dim headlights and interrupts this crime in progress. And eventually because of that, she's able to escape.
That fourth victim was Renee Sandoval. Surviving that attack is brave beyond all reason. Even braver, the power to talk about it for the first time publicly. Renee Sandoval was at the press conference and slowly walked up to the podium. It was silent in the room. She began to share her harrowing story.
This is a long time coming. I want to start by saying, thank you, God. I give you all the glory because He was with me that night. I prayed. He spoke to me. He's the reason that I'm here today. When I was a young kid, I was 22 at the time, I didn't always believe in God. Let me tell you, He's real. That's why I'm here. That's why I'm here today. Secondly, I want to thank my family, especially my girls. You know, they were babies when it happened. They were just little babies. Now they're grown. They're moms. They're the best daughters you could ever ask for. This is a tragedy. It's a horrible, horrible, horrible tragedy. But I have met some awesome people. I've met the Sposito, well, not met them, but I've spoke to them on the phone over and over. I've been in touch with another victim, the one before me, the one that the sheriff described. I ask that everybody in the community pray for these victims. Pray for all these people that have suffered a crime like this. Pray for those people who never had a voice, who were never given an opportunity. I got to kind of know Cathy from her brother, Sal. Love you, Sal. They were very, very close. He told me so much about her, about their family, things they've done together. And he never gave up. He never, ever gave up, never wavered. And today, she's free.
I was in awe of Renee's words. So was everyone in the room. And the support she is now giving not only the Sposito family, but also the other victims who don't want to be identified yet is incredible. After she spoke, the sheriff and the YCSO cold case unit opened up the room to questions, and all of us reporters had a lot. The first question was, did Cathy Sposito and Bryan Bennett know each other before the attack?
So the question is, can we talk about the connection between Bennett and Cathy? And we have no information that they knew each other in any way prior to that day. The information that we have, according to this investigation, is that she was stalked by him in the forest on that remote trail, attacked, screamed for help, was beaten, shot, and stabbed, and killed.
So often, murders are committed by people the victims know. A random attack at a popular hiking trail is just as concerning as the fear that set in at the time when nobody knew who killed Cathy. Remember earlier in the podcast, I said she was bludgeoned by a wrench and shot in the eye with a .22 caliber gun. I asked the sheriff if they knew when she actually died. Could she have been shot after she was already killed, like an FU shot? It wouldn't be the first time I'd seen that kind of evil.
So the question is, the fatal wound, was it the wrench or the shot in the eye? Does anybody know the answer to that? I don't believe that we have that answer.
So we don't know.
We don't know. No, but certainly an extremely aggressive overkill.
When it comes to DNA in a case and linking it by finding a familial match from a DNA profile, often it can hit to several members in the family. That's what happened here. It didn't just match to Bryan Scott Bennett, but to his brother, too.
It could either be Bryan Bennett, or it could be, Scott Bennett, or it could be his younger brother, whose also name was Scott. And his first name was Bryan Scott Bennett, his younger brother's name was Scott. Anyways, it could be one of the two of them. So we needed a solid DNA sample from Bryan Scott Bennett. Bryan Scott Bennett, when he committed suicide, was buried in Calhoun, Kentucky. So working with the Kentucky Attorney General's Office, Kentucky State Police, University of Tennessee, Marshall University, we were able to go back there, get an exhumation warrant.
Body parts were removed during the exhumation and sent to a certified laboratory, and we got a full profile from each of them. So it was definitely Bryan Bennett's DNA that we were looking at in the comparative analysis.
Lieutenant Dennison, who oversees the Criminal Investigations Unit, then explained their interactions with Bryan Bennett's brother.
Last year we did fly back to Kentucky and we tried to do the exhumation of Bryan Scott Bennett. We ran into some roadblocks, but while we were there, we went and spoke to his brother, and we did write a search warrant. We compelled him to give us his DNA. All indications are that his brother led a decent life, spoke to the mother, the daughter, and that Bryan has had a troubled past, that he's had a troubled youth.
By troubled, they explained Bryan liked to party. That's how they were able to rule Bryan Bennett's brother out as being involved and linked the crimes to him. The thing is, 4 victims like this is 4 too many, but YCSO does not believe these are his only ones. He lived in many states and had an interesting lifestyle from 16 years old until he died 7 years later.
Violent crime spree that he had here in Arizona, was that the only crimes that he committed, violent crimes he committed, or to your knowledge, were there more back in Kentucky?
We have no information that there are more back in Kentucky, but again, this is our hope of getting this out to the public, because he was in the military for only a year, and then he was a deserter. And in, I believe, December of 1989, they listed him as a deserter. So he only spent a short amount of time in the military, and he was, he spent a short amount of time in California and Kansas and Kentucky and North Carolina. And so, the heels of this public information push is to push this information to those areas and see if other people there were a victim. Now, we have made contact with law enforcement agencies. We're not able to locate any other specific cases. But what we know of serious violent predators like this is that it is very unlikely, given the frequency of which he was willing to act, that these are the only 4 cases that exist.
There is nothing more these investigators wanted than, after 26 years, to arrest Bryan Scott Bennett for the women's lives he affected or likely ended in especially brutal ways. I asked the sheriff how they all emotionally deal with the fact that this certainly brings closure and an end, but no arrest will ever be made, no trial will ever come, and no conviction will ever be had for these brave victims.
No, that's a great question. That's always the hope, right? Is that you're going to identify the suspect, the person that's responsible. You think you're going to go get them. They think they got away with it, and you're going to go get them, and you're going to drag them to jail, and you're going to drag them in front of the court, and you're going to get a conviction, and they're going to spend the rest of their days in prison. And that didn't happen here. It doesn't mean that it's any less significant, because the other role here is exactly what happened, is that we're giving voice back to the survivors. You're giving answers back to the survivors. You're giving answers back to the community. And I personally, the fact that he died by suicide was not a bad thing, because we spared 3 decades of additional victims. At the rate that he was victimizing people, that's 30 years that he would have had to be out there continuing to victimize other people.
He's right. It's sickening to think how many more victims there could be because of how prolific his crimes were. Yet, there are likely others out there who never reported their attack, and YCSO can only hope they will come forward. Renee Sandoval now considers Cathy Sposito part of her, kindred sisters in a way. Cathy Sposito did not die in vain, and Renee is now living in her honor, carrying a piece of Cathy in her heart at all times.
Cathy, you're free. Like, we're always going to be tied together. We're always going to have a connection. She will be with me till the day I die.
YCSO says Bryan Scott Bennett was going by the name Scott Bennett at the time of these attacks in the late 80s, early 90s. If you knew a Scott Bennett or have any information on other assaults or attacks he may have been involved in at the time, please call the Yavapai County Sheriff's Office. True Crime Arizona, the podcast, is hosted by me, Brianna Whitney, and produced by Sergio Hernandez. It's a production of Arizona's Family, 3TV, CBS 5, and azfamily.com in Phoenix, Arizona.
This is True Crime Arizona, an Arizona's Family Originals podcast.